Hello. In this video, we're going to continue our introduction to the multiplier approach. This video includes a spreadsheet-based exercise which we hope will help strengthen your understanding of the multiplier. Now, as we learned in a previous video, the idea of the multiplier is that we have autonomous shocks to aggregate demand that may emanate from one particular sector of the economy, but then these shocks tend to ripple through the economy as people spend their extra income, and we have additional rounds of spending. An example that we gave was how the revival of the housing market spilled over into other sectors of the economy, and according to the multiplier effect, we learned that the ultimate impact on economic activity of a particular shock can be larger than that initial shock itself. One of those conditions was that we assumed prices to be fixed. So we're going to start up with a warm-up analysis, one that captures the basic intuition behind the multiplier. So let's suppose that people decide to spend more because their house value has risen. We're going to think of this as an autonomous shock to spending. Ought C equals 1% of potential output. So if potential output is 14 trillion, the dollar amount of that initial spending shock will be 0.01 times 14 trillion, or $140 billion. Now, we're going to be thinking of rounds of spending. So the initial round of spending will be 140 billion, and the people who spend that, they'll be buying goods and services. Someone will be receiving that money, and they'll be spending a fraction of that money, and they'll be spending 1 minus their marginal propensity to save out of cyclical income. So we're noting that this is cyclical income. It's not long-term income. It's not permanent income. So we call 1 minus sigma sic. Another name is the marginal propensity to consume out of cyclical income. The second round of spending, they'll be spending 1 minus sigma sic times the original 1%. In the third round of spending, people will spend 1 minus sigma sic times that 1 minus sigma sic, and we can shorten that, just call it 1 minus sigma sic squared times the original 1%. And we'll notice that since 1 minus sigma sic is less than 1, we're going to be spending progressively smaller and smaller fractions in each successive round. So we're going to be thinking about successive rounds where we're going to be seeing that the additional spending becomes progressively smaller and smaller. 1 minus sigma sic to the third, 1 minus sigma sic to the fourth, and so on. So now we're going to go see how this works out in a spreadsheet. So here we can see our assumptions that 1 minus the marginal propensity to save out of the transitory income, 1 minus sigma sic. Another name for that is the propensity to consume out of the gap or out of transitory income, is 30%. That means that we're saving 70% of our transitory income. Our potential output is 14 trillion. So we've assumed that our initial shock will be 1% of potential output. So we can calculate this in billions of dollars. So that's 1 times potential output, and we're going to nail down potential output here, and we're going to multiply everything by 1,000 so I can get from trillions to billions. So you can see 1%, or 140 billion. In our second round of spending, we're going to be spending 1 minus sigma sic up here times the previous round, and I just want to pin down the propensity to consume. So you can see that 30% of 1% is 0.3%. That's in our second round. And then if we want to compute that in terms of billions of dollars, once again, all we need to do is multiply this amount, the 0.3%, times potential output. And what do we get? We get $42 billion. Let's now do our third round of spending. Now all we need to do here is apply, again, the marginal propensity to consume out of the gap times our previous increment of spending, and you can see that we get 0.09%, and in terms of billions of dollars, we get $12.6 billion. Now in the next round of spending, again, we take the marginal propensity to consume and multiply it times what we had previously spent, and we get how much? We get 0.27%, or how many billions of dollars? $3.8 billion. Let's do this for a few more rounds here. Let's copy that. 0.0018, or 1.1. And what I'm going to do now, since we get the flavor of this, I'm going to copy this. And you can see that in terms of billions of dollars, this gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And in terms of percentage of GDP, this gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and ultimately it approaches zero. Now let's take a look at the cumulative impact. The cumulative impact is adding up each round. So the initial round was just 1%. In the second round, the cumulative impact was the 1% plus the 0.3%, or 1.30. In the third round, the cumulative impact is 1.39. In the fourth round, the cumulative impact is 1.42, and so on and so on. And you're going to see here that we're actually going to top out here at 1.43%. Now let's look at this in terms of billions of dollars. In our first round, it was 140, so now we're going to be adding up $140 billion plus the 42. That's $182 billion. Then we're going to be going next to $194.6 billion, which is the 182 plus 12.6. And I think that you can see the pattern here. So we're just going to add it up, and ultimately we converge on $200 billion. So that's the ultimate impact of our initial $140 billion spending shock. So this is the multiplier principle. It's telling us that the ultimate impact of our shock is greater. It has magnified the initial value of that shock. Something that you may remember from your high school algebra class. We can think of this as an infinite series. We can think of this guy, 1 minus the cyclical propensity to save, as x, and we can think of x to the 0th plus x to the 1st plus x to the 2nd plus x to the 3rd. And if you remember what you learned in your high school algebra class, this converges to 1 over 1 minus x. So we can calculate this, and it turns out that that's going to be 1 over sigma 6. So let's calculate that. That's 1 over 1 minus this guy here. And then we're going to take this and we're going to multiply it by the amount of our original shock, which was 1%, and we find our infinite horizon result. It's the same number here and here. It's 1.43%, and then we can take this number here once again to get our billions of dollars by multiplying this times 1,000. So once again, what we've learned is that through successive rounds of spending, and I must caution you that we're holding prices constant. If prices were to rise, then some of these multiplier effects would be dampened. Why? Because people would cut back their spending. But under these circumstances, we get a famous multiplier result. The idea is that the original shock, in which case was 1%, has been magnified to 1.43%. the ultimate impact on the economy.